I had something on my mind in regards to a video titled Doom Eternal is Offensively Boring. The author of that on YouTube being Griffin Gaming, who made the video in response to an article of that title, Doom Eternal is Offensively Boring, or rather, a particular joke made in Doom Eternal.
Remember, demon can be an offensive term, referred to them as mortally challenged.
And the developers, id Software, are catering to their audience who they assume aren't political or aren't going to be interested in radical politics.
Was it for political satire purposes? It seems like a very strong possibility, but given that I know nothing surrounding the political leanings of id Software, I can't say for certain. My best guess for why id Software put it in the trailer is for the reason that we have seen unfold in the aftermath of the gameplay reveal, to trigger the living hell, yes pun intended, out of the far-left SJWs that plague the gaming industry in order to drum up press surrounding the game among gamers, and it has worked wonders. For every triggered SJW who now refuses to buy a game they never intended on buying anyway, there are over 1,000 paying customers excited and ready to buy the game. What id has done here is a stroke of genius on their part. They have actually catered to their audience, and I know this may sound like a completely foreign idea to a lot of you out there in this day and age with companies like EA, Activision, Ubisoft.
Effectively, the politics in this situation is of, according to Griffin Gaming anyways, radical left-wing politicians or politic where anyone is allowed to come through American borders, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. The way that Griffin is explaining that is that it's kind of ridiculous, it's poking fun at that idea by making a joke. What the other person who wrote the original article that he was responding to was trying to state was that there is a tendency during times of xenophobia to demonize something is a practice that doesn't always stay radical, and then it becomes par for the course. From a political standpoint, that's something that you have to historically keep in mind. So in so much as video games are just a joke, it's just a fantasy, it's not meant to be seen as part of reality, they also reflect the attitudes of the consumer culture who's buying them repeatedly. And as much as you want to keep politics out of the game is referring to something outside of itself. On one end of the spectrum, Griffin Gaming is someone who believes that politics should be left out of games, and that games can make jokes that don't necessarily mean anything other than the punchline that they're going for in game. But the fact of the matter is, demonization as a practice is something that historically exists, and not in a radical way in the sense of it being relegated to a small group of people. So despite the fact that consumers who insist on being apolitical, the things that they're joking about have real world implications beyond whatever apolitical setting the game tries to establish. And that people who play games can recognize that and make arguments in response to whatever the game is trying to say, whatever joke the game is trying to make. It's more than a joke to certain individuals who are the audience of the game. These aren't just people that you can call social justice warriors and alienate or demonize themselves. These are individuals who buy these games, who have more interest than just playing the game. They play the game, but they also have political aspirations that don't fall square in the middle. The Doom knows their audience, and they know that most people who play their game aren't going to be upset. I would make that statement through the supposition that there is only one or two isolated incidents of a joke. It doesn't necessarily take up a lot of the gameplay experience, and having played Doom, and given how anti-cinematic it is, and how most of the gameplay consists of one killing demons, this is effectively a safe bet. I can't imagine there being one joke after another where they're constantly sticking it to social justice warriors per se. It's interesting how Griffin Gaming in his video talks about the fact that social justice warriors are this group of radicals, and yet they're comprised of all of these minorities in a way that doesn't matter because they've been pushed aside. they're seen as irrelevant, or they're seen as irrational, that they're incapable of making arguments. So when dealing with them, you deal with them the same way you would a demon in Doom. You just blast them apart. You treat them as demons. They're not people, they're idiots, they're irrational.
They are rage, brutal, without mercy. But you will be worse. Rip and tear until it is done.
That type of narration that starts at the beginning of Doom 2016 basically sums up how Griffin would expect one to deal with these individuals. It doesn't really seem to allow a lot of leeway towards their side of the argument, because according to him, Doom doesn't allow it. Doom isn't a room for politics. And yet, there is a real world kind of precedent in Doom 2016. The entire motivation of the UAC is to solve an energy crisis, and that they are effectively taking that energy from the original inhabitants of hell. They're colonizing hell. And as horrible and monstrous as these things are, you are effectively stealing their energy from them. You're taking what's theirs away from them, and you feel justified because they're not human. So to say that there's no political room for conversation in Doom isn't true, especially with the way that the game has evolved for current audiences. Now, granted, I think I represent sort of a minority in that I'm not the kind of individual who just plays the game and shoots blindly. I have a tendency with any text to sort of criticize what I'm looking at according to what the text provides, mind you. So I am an individual who can play Doom and enjoy it for what it is, and at the same time read into the violence. There is a political message, and that political message can be read a number of different ways. And personally, I don't really identify as someone who's in the middle. If you had to pin me on the chart, I would probably fall somewhat to the left. But that doesn't mean that because I play Doom, that is invalidated. If the game is apathetic or not politically involved, that doesn't mean that you, as an individual who has their own political beliefs, automatically corrected. We're not determined entirely by the product. And furthermore, the product in this case isn't something that is entirely neutral either. And the whole point of the article that the person wrote is that there is kind of a danger in that this colonization of hell is not simply us against them in a way that is completely removed from the real world. There is a historical precedent for this in a way that is dangerous, in the same sense that one can look at a critic like that and relegate them to an undesirable position as social justice warrior and demonize them. The cosmetic depiction of demons is a facade for something beyond that. In instances of colonization where people invade other countries and destroy the indigenous population and take what they own away from them, that is in and of itself something that's going on beneath the superficial details. So it's important to take a lot of these things into consideration and not just judge things as one would a book by its cover. I'm not, of course, giving the person who wrote the article a pass, but I'm also not giving Griffin Gaming a pass by saying that he is well within his rights to say or do whatever he wants, because then he's just Doom Guy, someone who's full of anger and rage, who's just as inconsolable as the demons. In that particular dance of combat, it takes two to tango. Doom Guy isn't just someone who's oppressed by a demonic invading force. He's also a member of someone who's invading hell and killing its population to steal from them. It goes both ways. It's not a one-way street. So whatever argument that Griffin applies to the author of the article also applies to him. And yet he seems to see himself as righteous or belonging to a group that isn't radical, a group that is in the middle of something that isn't politically ensconced, but rather something that just makes a passing joke. And all it is a joke. Well, for certain people in the world, demonization is a very real thing. It's not a joke. And it is entirely within the realms of possibility for a gamer to be aware of that and still play Doom and enjoy it. So the person who wrote the article likes video games, and Griffin Gaming even points that out. They say, look, I agree with this author on this particular point, but I disagree with them about this, and I'm doing that because I'm going to affiliate them with this group, Social Justice Warriors, which really is just a place where you put someone from an argumentative standpoint to demonize them. And yet the things that you're doing exhibit behavior similar to the place where you're putting your opponent. Okay, it's hypocritical. I don't necessarily agree. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that one bit, because as much as the approach of the author might not be to the tastes of Griffin, he's essentially giving himself carte blanche, immunity to the arguments that he's leveling at his opponent, but it just doesn't work like that. And furthermore, he's awfully presumptuous about the people that play Doom. And furthermore, the people that he's antagonizing, treating as other, treating as demon, treating as radical. All these different terms have the same end result in terms of an argument where the person in an exchange is reduced to something that isn't worth considering and that you can overpower and treat however you want. You shouldn't do that with someone. It's ad hominem. You're attacking the person, not the argument. Certainly, Griffin Gaming does examine the person's argument in and of itself, but he also has a tendency to do it by attacking the author too, and saying that they belong to a certain political group and that you should ignore what they say by virtue of that. And that's not good rhetoric. There are better ways to go about it. Just attack what the person is saying. And furthermore, Griffin Gaming makes certain assumptions about transsexuals and transgender that just aren't true. They don't mean the same thing. He says that they mean the same thing. And notice how he starts pulling things like that, which the original author of the article states. He brings up notions of transgender and sexuality. He mentions that in his argument, and then Griffin responds to it by essentially conflating those aspects and saying that they're the same thing and that the person is dividing them purely through a sense of entitlement that is not deserved, because they're essentially a group of fools, of radical fools that he can attack. He's effectively taking away their autonomy in that statement by saying that everything that comes out of their mouth isn't worth saying, but he's making it from a position of ignorance as someone outside of these groups, because people who are transgender do it according to a particular way that they want to analyze things. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Gender is performative in nature. Someone who is transgender is someone who is altering their gender, the way that they're seen as masculine or feminine, through a performance. Okay, whereas transsexual implies surgical medical procedures where you are altering your biological sex. Those are two different things, but it requires an understanding or recognition that they are different. And Griffin Gaming is insisting that they are the same thing. He is of that opinion, and he is saying that the other person is wrong because their opinion is different than his, without really saying why beyond that. He's simply placing them into a group, saying that that group is wrong by virtue of what they are and how they feel, and that is in and of itself enough to prove him right. These kinds of arguments can be made in ways that aren't ridiculous. If someone makes the argument relative to video games and the video games themselves aren't as immediately concerned, it doesn't mean that you can't synthesize the two. And you should be open to that idea, regardless of where the message comes from. It doesn't automatically mean that it's wrong. And he's kind of saying that from a position of ignorance, as someone who is admittedly an outsider, and furthermore, who sees himself as superior and confident in his own views, even when those are wrong. That's problematic to me. And it leads him to see these persons as minorities and is more willing to attack them, to subjugate or dominate them in a way that isn't really conducive to good argument, to a debate. This isn't a debate. This is one person seeing themselves as better than the other, invalidating their arguments through violence. That in and of itself doesn't fly with me. And I love playing Doom. I love violence if you're just killing demons, but the moment you start taking that approach and applying it in various guises or forms to the real world with real people who have real politics and feelings and who also play the same game that you do, that's where it starts to become an issue for me.